So thank you all for coming out. My name is Rich Holdeman. I'm one of the pastors of the Bloomington Reformed Presbyterian Church, the church that is connected to this cemetery. And we appreciate you coming out. It's a gorgeous day. I know you're missing the IU football game to be here. It's looking really good. I can just say it's looking really good so far. So hopefully it'll keep going our way while we're out here. Just a couple of housekeeping things. There is water. We don't want anyone getting dehydrated out here, so feel free to grab a drink. There are also some resources over there just about the church. But then also, our church celebrated its 200th anniversary in 2021. And Cheryl Mullen, who I think's out here, yeah, so Cheryl did an amazing amount of work to put together a history of our congregation. And so some of the things I'll be talking about connect to our church and its history. And it's really tied to the history of Bloomington. And we've been here almost as long as Bloomington's been here. So there's some really fascinating things in here. So you can see pictures of some of the people I'll be referring to and some of the people connected to these markers and things like that. So if you're interested, I think that's $20, and you're welcome to buy one of those. So are we ready to begin? Anybody have any questions before we start? We're all ready? Okay, well, the first question people sometimes ask is, why is there a cemetery here at all? You see, it's a very busy, it's a residential neighborhood, and this seems like a weird place to put a cemetery. But you have to realize this cemetery started in the 1830s, 20s and 30s, and at that time, this was 2 miles outside of town. Indiana did not become a state until 1816. And in 1816, there was estimated about 63,000 people living in Indiana. And a lot of it, if you look at old maps then, a lot of it was still Indian territory. In fact, Monroe County was one of the farthest northern counties that was actually organized at that time. Some people think that Bloomington at that time, which is founded 1818, had maybe a few hundred people living in it. So when the Scotch-Irish Presbyterians came out here starting in 1820, there wasn't a lot here. They were farmers, and they came here. This was a group of Scotch-Irish folks who had immigrated from Northern Ireland in the 1770s. There was a group of 5 ships that came over and landed in Charleston, South Carolina in 1772. And several hundred families settled in Chester County, South Carolina. So that's in the upcountry, sort of the middle, the northern part of South Carolina. Now, part of the logic there was, and I'm not trying to cause offense to anyone, knowing we have lots of different backgrounds, but the Anglicans, who tended to be along the coast, the supporters of the monarchy, had the good land, and they really wanted a buffer between themselves and the Indians. So they were offering these Scotch-Irish folks free land if you would come in and be the buffer between us and the Indians. So it wasn't great land. In fact, they settled around just south of Chester, South Carolina, an area called Rocky Creek. Interestingly, in a lot of ways, like Bloomington, very hilly, very rocky, very heavily wooded. And so they were tobacco farmers and other farmers there, and they planted a number of churches in that area. The Reformed Presbyterian Church, which traces its roots back to Scotland, took a very early stance against slavery. So as of 1800, you could not be a communicant member of the church and be a slaveholder, that was a radical position for North and South in those days. So it was kind of the Quakers, the Reformed Presbyterians, and then a few other groups who took that stance. Obviously, being a pro or an anti-slavery group in South Carolina was very difficult for these people. One of the things they tried to do was to change the laws for example, so that you could actually free slaves. Some of these folks purchased slaves with the idea that we will then free them. Well, that was against the law. You could not free a slave. You would have to sell the slave to somebody else and keep the person in slavery. So after failing to be successful at changing the laws, they started immigrating out of South Carolina. And so there were hundreds and hundreds of these Scotch-Irish Presbyterians that moved out this way and settled in southern Ohio, southern Indiana, and southern Illinois. So there was a church in Madison, there was a church in Princeton, Indiana, this church in Bloomington, and then several in Ohio and Illinois. Most of those churches were in small farming areas and do not survive to this day. One of the unique things about the group that came here is they came right around the time that the Indiana State Seminary was being started in 1820. That's what became Indiana University. And so there was a real interest in education and especially the training of ministers. And so Bloomington actually became kind of a hotbed of Presbyterians. And in fact, there's a great quote back from David Starr Jordan back when he was the president of the university, so the mid-1800s. He said, in Bloomington we have our Reformed Presbyterians and we have our United Presbyterians, and then we have our Presbyterians who are neither Reformed nor United. And there were so many different Presbyterian groups in town. Well, the Reformed Presbyterians started their congregation in 1821, and they met in a log building. It was used as a school and different homes for a while, but then built their first building just on this land right over here. So there's 160 acres here that was owned by Thomas Smith, and he was one of the early elders of the church. His house is still there on Pickwick Place. Like if you go around on Pickwick Place, and they've really done a nice job restoring it. So that was the original farmhouse for 160 acres here. Went all the way up to Maxwell, all the way over to College Mall Road from here. So a huge area here. He carved off about 2 to 2.5 acres here, and he sold it for $1. So essentially gave it to the church. And so the meeting house was a brick building that was up here that was built in 1836, and the church met here, there, and then the graveyard was here. If you looked on the entryway, it says that this cemetery was founded in 1832. It's kind of hard to, how do you prove that? That's the earliest record we have of a burial happening here. So it sounds like they were actually using the land and using it as a seminary even prior to when the Smiths deeded it over to them, because they didn't deed it over till 1839, and the congregation was using it here prior to that. So the original building burned down in the 1840s. They rebuilt it. In the 1870s, 1877, the church, which was called at that time the Bethesda congregation, because this farming area out here was called Bethesda at that time, and most of them were farming different areas around here. They decided to move into town, and they changed the name then in 1877 to the Bloomington Reformed Presbyterian Church, a very definite decision. We're going to minister to this community. So the second location of the church was on Walnut and 3rd, which is where the bus station is right now. So we have pictures of that old building. It was an old brick building right on Walnut, and was right up in there close to the downtown. In 1927, the church decided to move south, and so it moved to its current location, which is at the corner of Lincoln and First Street. So I joke about it's one of the biggest buildings you just drive by and nobody notices it, because it's just in amongst all these houses. It's a totally residential neighborhood. But in 1927, that was the southern edge of town. And so they were kind of on the south side of town there. And south of them, the people used to call that the circus grounds. There was a lot of open space there, and when the circus came to town, they would set up in that area. So the church kept the cemetery, and we have a separate committee within the church that's a separate corporation that's responsible for the cemetery. Interesting story, the land, once they moved into town, they sold the land that was where the church building had been to a former slave named Robert Anderson, who had grown up in slavery. After the Emancipation Proclamation, he'd been freed. He came up from Louisville, settled in Bloomington. He was a member of our congregation and did odd jobs and things for the church. And the church sold him. It was funny, there was some lore, I don't know, at some point somebody said the land was given to him. And the Anderson relatives, they get together every other year or so, and there's quite a reunion. And so one of them came to me and said, hey, we have to get this straightened out. The church didn't give him the land, he bought it. And I said, I know that, I've seen the deed. He paid $25 in 1880 for that land and paid it off over time. And descendants of Robert Anderson still live over here to this day. There's some famous ones you might know, like Jared Jeffries, who played at IU and then played 11 years in the NBA. He's one of the Andersons. I thought I would just read a little summary of one of Robert Anderson's grandsons who made his way down to Selma, Alabama after growing up here. One of the things the Reformed Presbyterian Church did is after the end of slavery, they were really committed to educating the freed blacks who had been denied education. And so we set up schools around the South. And in Selma, Alabama, there was a Reformed Presbyterian Church that established a school that was a K through 12 school called Knox Academy. And so Bloomington actually sent some people down there to help teach at Knox Academy. And this is the obituary in 1964 of one of Robert Anderson's grandsons, William James Anderson. And in the obituary, this was in the Selma Times Journal, it said, in a church with 62 communicant members in 1963 and a Sabbath school of 110, so that's a lot of kids, there were 6 elders to help carry the load. An important part of the church's ministry came to an end in 1964 with the death of William James Anderson, who died at Burwell Hospital that he ran. Anderson, a native of Bloomington, Indiana, and a graduate of the University of Indiana. People can't get that right? It's Indiana, but we'll forgive them in this case. A graduate of the University of Indiana came to Selma about 50 years ago to teach at Old Knox Academy, then operated by the Reformed Presbyterian Church. His wife was a nurse at the hospital. In addition to their 3 sons, Robert F. Anderson, an electronics engineer of Hampton, Virginia, Marius Anderson of Selma, and William James Anderson, Jr., a teacher at Grambling State University in Louisiana, the Andersons reared and educated 36 foster children. So what a legacy out of this little area here. Well, one of the things that is really unique about the cemetery is the fact that for a cemetery that was operating in the middle of the 19th century, they buried African Americans here. I went to visit the birthplace of this church in terms of the states back in South Carolina, and one of their old graveyards there, they just had one marker, and they said, this is to honor all of our African American members whose graves are not marked, because it was illegal in South Carolina to bury blacks in cemeteries with whites. And so when they came up here, they were absolutely committed to having an integrated cemetery. And in fact, a number of the African American graves are right in this area, and we're going to talk about some particular ones in just a moment. Before I do that, though, I do need to say something about this tree. You don't have to. No, you don't.
Oh, no,
you're fine.
Okay.
You're fine.
I knew you were good
so,
earlier.
the best we can tell, and I saw one of you was counting, and so you can tell me if your numbers are different, but we think this tree is about 175 years old when it had to be cut down in 2021. It broke our hearts, but anyone who's been around here knows, right, that the emerald ash borer has destroyed all the ash trees, and this was one of the last ones standing in Monroe County. We understood that this was the largest ash tree in the county at one time, and probably that was partly why it lasted so long, because those things were eating away at it, but it was just so big. So when this came down and we had to take it down, we tried to make lemonade out of our lemons, and so we had a local craftsman take wood from the tree. And so these are the offering plates that we use in the church over on First and Lincoln, and these get used every week. So it's a way to remember this important part of the cemetery. Okay, what else? So before we move on, I guess the last thing I'll say is the other thing unique about the cemetery is the type of wall. So this is a dry stack wall. In Scotland, these are called dikes, and so the technology for doing this, came through Scotland, Northern Ireland, and then into the States. Sadly, and you're going to see this as we move around, there are very few people who know how to deal with these kind of walls anymore. We had a guy, if we had something go down, we call him, he'd come right out and fix it. He retired. He was in his 80s, so we can forgive him for retiring. The problem is there's nobody else that we have been able to find in this county. So the people on the cemetery committee are now interacting with, there's a guild in Kentucky, is the closest one we found, and we're trying to work with them to bring them up here. The result has been, and you'll especially see it on the east side, because of the trees along there, and one tree in particular got knocked over, we've had some sections of the wall collapse. Probably the most surprising collapse, I got a call one day a couple years ago, and they said, you need to come out and look at the cemetery wall. And so over there, a person had been going down the street this way and apparently had reached for something in the back, or something had happened, took a 90-degree turn and just launched right through our wall. And so probably, because it's dry stack, it did fall over, and the person, wasn't seriously injured, but it was quite a sight to see a car parked kind of over top of the wall. So moved the car, the man came, restacked it as good as new. So hopefully we'll be able to get these things taken care of when we get a group up here who can do that. All right, any questions so far? Okay, well, yeah, go ahead.
Is the cemetery full, or are there still...
Okay, that's a great question. The cemetery, there are about 420 people buried here. On paper, the cemetery can hold like 720. I think that's incredible. So theoretically, there's room for 300 more graves. That to me seems absurdly optimistic. And this was platted when people were shorter, and they didn't require a vault, right? So now you have to have a vault, so stuff's not sliding around underground. Well, these older graves, from the 1800s and stuff moves around in there. So it's a little tricky, but the answer is yes, there are still some spaces available. The cemetery is reserved for members of the congregation and people who have immediate family members in here already. It's just not enough room to make it open to the public. So it's kind of a strange selling point, right? Join our church and you can be buried here. But that is the way it works. Actually, if you turn around and look right where Philip's standing there, that stone right there, you see it says Wendell Faris. That's a McBurney family on the bottom. Wendell is one of the, he's an elder emeritus at the church. He's 89 years old and still very healthy. His wife, Jean, so this is one of the most recent burials of one of our members. His wife, Jean, died in 2021. So that is a brand new marker And you see they really worked hard to make it kind of fit with some of the older ones that are in the cemetery. And so we still do burials to this day.
The Faris house is right over here.
Yes, I'll talk about that in just a minute. Yes.
Mr. Curry.
Yeah, Mr. Curry. Yeah, we'll say more about that. All right, let's move over here. And again, if you need water, just grab some. So actually, you guys can just stay and pivot and let me come on the other side. Okay, so in this area right here, we know there are a number of African Americans who are buried. And again, a radical concept in the 1800s. Unfortunately, the grave of Robert Anderson, the slave that bought this land, is right in here and is unmarked. Some folks from a local history group in town have been working with us about trying to acknowledge his grave in some way, and so we're working on how to do that in the future. Some other notable African Americans buried here. So one is Lizzie Breckenridge. So Lizzie, at age 13, went into the employment of T.A. Wiley. So if anyone knows the Wiley House on 2nd Street and Lincoln, it's a historical house run by the university. It's a great tour if you haven't seen that. So he was, I think, the second president of the university seminary that became the college. And Lizzie served in his home for 50 years and was able actually to buy her own home on Washington Street. Very unusual for that time as a single African-American woman. She was so well known, and that's her picture there on the board, that the Indianapolis News acknowledged her long-term service and then ran a competition. This was in 1950 around, for the woman that had been in service in one home the longest in the whole state, in honor of Lizzie. So I don't know who won that and how they judged that, but she actually had quite a bit of notoriety in a good way, even in her day. The Wileys taught her to read, and she was very well educated and very widely read. She was a member of our church. One of the fascinating things, and Cheryl's book talks about this, is that back in the 1800s, and really up until early 1900s, when the church celebrated communion, it was what we call a common cup. So there was one cup that was passed around, and everybody drank out of that one cup. We don't do that anymore. We know a lot more about germs, than they did then. But there was something really profound about having African American members of your congregation drinking out of the same cup. So it's one thing to put them in your cemetery or to let them attend your worship services, but to drink out of their cup. When places in the South, you had to have separate drinking fountains and all the rest. So they were a progressive group back in the 1800s. All right, so let me see a couple other well-known African Americans. So this is the McCaws, I think. Yeah, Henry and Hannah McCaw. So Hannah McCaw is thought to have been one of the local leaders on the Underground Railroad. So because of their commitment to the abolitionist position, the Reformed Presbyterians, when they came up here, were very active on the Underground Railroad. So if you read in Bloomington's literature about, it's on the Underground Railroad, it's mostly Reformed Presbyterians and some others who were on that group, and they would move slaves through this area and then on up to Mooresville and then on to the north. So Hannah McCaw comes up in some of the literature as being one of the conductors. So again, an African American woman. Her husband Henry had spent some time as a slave, and they were also part of the congregation that served here.
That's his grave.
What's that?
That's Henry's grave.
This is Henry's grave here. All right, thank you. So, okay, let's go over here a little bit. So I want to point out these 5 stones right here. So I think the writing is probably on this side over here. So this is the Cubit family, and it's a little bit faded, but this is the mother, and then these are 4 children, and this one was 11, this one was 13, this one was 9, and this one was 7. And they all died within a month or so of each other in 1854. I went back and looked at the church minutes to try to figure out if we could tell what happened. And there is a reference to them that the elders wrote, and they said, this reminds us that we always need to be ready to die, in other words. I mean, it's a difficult time, and a lot of children don't make it to adulthood. There was a cholera epidemic around that time, so we think that's probably what it was. Could be yellow fever, could be influenza. Those were other things that hit this area. But it is a really sobering reminder of the kind of challenges our forebears faced in terms of just dealing with all the disease that was around. And to have that many people gone out of one family is pretty striking. Well, as we walk over here, I just look at the names on the stones and just, mark some of these: Kennedy, Latimer, Curry, Smith, Woodburn. Are those names ringing a bell with anyone? You recognize those? Okay, so these are the founding families of the church, and you know that those are the names of streets in town. Those are the names of a lot of different families. Just in case you're keeping score, anyone want to guess what the most common name in here is? It's actually, it's tricky because I took you to an area where there aren't too many of them. Faris. Okay, good. So there's 50 Farises here, where that name is actually, 46 Smiths, 25 Currys, 23 Moores, 18 Craigs, and 16 Russells. So those are the most common names here. But those are foundational Bloomington names. There are some other names associated with the church too. So this street right here is called High Street. So that's the Magnificent Mile in Edinburgh, Scotland, is the High Street. And so that is named in honor of the Reformed Presbyterians, the Scotch-Irish Presbyterians. There's also a road down there called Covenanter Drive, right? And so I didn't mention this before, but back in Scotland, the nickname for the Reformed Presbyterians was the Covenanters, because they had covenanted themselves to the idea that the nation should show allegiance to Jesus Christ as its king. And so they brought that nickname into the States with them. So Covenanter Drive is also a nickname from this church.
Is your church responsible for the plaque that now rests on Covenanter Drive?
No, we're not. So you mean right up there? Yeah, I've seen that. It's great. I think my understanding is the property owner there sort of wanted to pay tribute to the spirit of the Covenanter. It's a very nice. So if you stay on it and go past College Mall Road up into those apartment complexes up there, there's a really nice sign that talks about the sacrifices they made, to serve here. Yeah, being on the Underground Railroad was not a popular stance, and there are some really fascinating stories of situations where they took on quite a risk to help the escaped slaves. All right, so I have another question for you. So here is a Latimer grave, and so the names here are Lizzie S. and Clarence L. Does anyone know what well-known street, I guess it depends on what side of town you live on, but what well-known street is named for this couple? Clariz, right? So Lizzie and Clarence, Clariz Drive is named for these two because the Latimer farm used to sit where much of the mall is today. So up there where the bakehouse used to be, and then is it a hot chicken place now? I don't know what's there. That was where the farmhouse was, right along 3rd Street, and then all the land going back all the way to Moores Pike was their farm. And so there's a little area now called Latimer Woods that's been preserved, and that was that family. As best as we understand, so the church sat here. There was a road. Can you guys see the greenhouse right there? The greenhouse right there with the roof coming down. At one time, the sexton of the cemetery lived there, and they've got a little plaque in the front. There was a road that went basically just south of that house that went over this direction, and so the church would have sat like up on that road, and so that was where the road that went east and west used to be. All right, well, let's, as we go over here, just keep coming over. One thing you might notice, and I haven't pointed out any of them, is there's artwork on a number of these stones. So there's a little lamb over there where we have the table set up, which is commonly used when a child dies young. There are a number of crosses, praying hands, weeping willows, birds, and then different Bible verses. So as you're looking, you might notice some of those. Now, one of the interesting things about the Reformed Presbyterians, and the reason from a human standpoint that they remained a distinct denomination, is that they took a stand against the Constitution of our country. So bear with me for just a second. So they thought the Constitution was a worthy document in many ways, but it did not acknowledge Christ as king explicitly. And so that was a problem for them coming out of a situation where, in their context in Scotland, the king was the head of the church, and that had caused a lot of trauma for them and a lot of persecution. So that was one issue. Another issue was that the Constitution tacitly approved of slavery, because you had worked into that this 3/5 concept. How are you going to count the slaves? The South wanted the slaves to count as full people for representation, so they would get more representatives. The North said, well, you can't count the slaves. You're not treating them like people. So the compromise was, we'll count them as 3/5 of a person. Well, the Reformed Presbyterian says, you're acknowledging that we accept this as a system we can live with. We can't live with it. So those were two major issues. And so as a result, the Reformed Presbyterians said, we cannot take an oath to uphold that Constitution. And furthermore, then if it's not right to take that oath, then we shouldn't be running for office and we shouldn't be voting for people in office. So they went many, many years. So right, it's a very unusual position, and there are some fascinating books about this position historically, because it was very unique. Over time, and actually not till the 1960s, the church changed that position in such that it no longer forbids members from voting. But I say that by way of preface because there are a number of war veterans buried here. And so sometimes people hear, oh, they didn't vote, they're pacifists, and they just separate from all of the workings, and that's not true at all. They love the country. They fought in the Revolutionary War, those down in South Carolina. They fought in the Civil War. They fought in World War I. They fought in World War II. All of that before they were voting. Their reasons for not voting were totally different. So they did believe in fighting for a just cause, and this is one example here. So this is John H. Curry, so one of the Currys, who was a private in Company K in the 133rd Indiana Infantry Regiment in the Civil War. He came back, he survived the war, and he is one of 37 veterans that are buried in the cemetery. So a total of 12 Civil War veterans, 7 World War I, and 20 World War II veterans. Now, an interesting story, and maybe a cautionary tale for those of you who go to church meetings. So he was, after he came back from the war, he was a farmer, and he was one of the elders in our congregation. And it said that he took a train to a church meeting in Ohio, and then returned early feeling sick, and passed away just 10 days later in his obituary from toxic poisoning. Nobody knows what that meant at all, whether that was just an infection or whatever. So perhaps a cautionary tale for those going to church meetings. It didn't work out. He passed away. Now, what's really fascinating is his grandson is the oldest living member of our congregation. His grandson, Lawrence Curry, was the first baby baptized in our current building in 1927, and he just turned 98 a couple of weeks ago, still lives on his own, and for years and years and years, he watched over the cemetery. So he's retired from that now, but quite a legacy that this family has had. As you can see, we're over here. This is the older part of the cemetery. One of the challenges we have is that there are graves available. There's space available over here, but it's very hard to get equipment in here. If you look back, where the road is, they've kind of blocked it off. So we may get to the point where we'll have to be very creative to use some of the spots here. A number of the graves, sadly, are hard to read. We do have a plot map that kind of tells us where everyone is, but time and weather has taken its toll on a number of these. All right, I want to. You have a question there, or? I want to show you. I think we want to move back this way. Who's Eric? Who's on the stone right there? Is that? That's McClintock. All right. It may be this one here that I'm looking for. Smith. Okay, yeah. All right, so this is the stone for Thomas and Jane Smith. So this is the couple that lived at Pickwick Place and basically gave this land to the church. And Thomas served as an elder for many years. We know that their house was on the Underground Railroad. There's a written account of at least several times where they kept escaped slaves. One time in one of their barns, in the loft of the barn. There's a really interesting story where the slave catchers, so people were basically bounty hunters, and if they could get the slaves back to Louisville, they could be paid for them. Even though Louisville was technically a free state, they allowed a lot of the trafficking to go on. So there were at least 5 different families in the Bloomington area that were slave catchers. And so there's a fascinating story about this family helping a slave named Tony, who was hidden in their barn, and then they put him underneath a load of hay in the bottom of a wagon, and actually had 2 different wagons right out of their farm. One of them was, whipped the horses and went off at a fast pace out toward Unionville. The other one rode right downtown, stopped, tied up the horses, talked to people, and just made a slow, leisurely pass. So the slave catchers all, of course, followed the guy going fast toward Unionville, and there was nothing in that one, and the slave had been taken right through downtown and then up to Mooresville and successfully on his way. So they were pretty resourceful. And in that account, there's a comment made by one of the observers that the slave catchers were debating just shooting these men, but they were told that they stood too high in the community to just gun them down. These are the Reformed Presbyterians. So So it's a different time back then when your reputation in the community is the only thing keeping you from getting shot. But it was a dangerous business. All right, so let's move over here. The Woodburn name, obviously there's a Woodburn Hall at the university campus that's connected to that family. So the next grave I want to show you right here is James Faris. So this again is his wife Nancy's buried here. So James Faris, the first pastor of the Reformed Presbyterian congregation of Bethesda, which relation he sustained about 25 years with a prudence and humility rarely exhibited, born in May 1791 and died May 1855. His bereaved family and flock erect this monument in token of sincere affection and esteem. So he was the first pastor of the congregation. He was one of the men who was in South Carolina. He has a fascinating story. He was an orphan who was raised by an aunt and uncle. He was kind of self-educated, and then he went to the University of South Carolina, I think.
Columbia.
At Columbia.
It became South
Say that again?
It was Columbia University, and it became the University.
Okay, it became the University of South Carolina. He then was running a very successful school called the Pendleton School, and because of the slavery issue, he basically walked away from everything he had. And he came out here and took the job of being the pastor of the church for $50 a year. And even back then, that was not enough to live on. So he had to take up farming to supplement his income. He came out here hoping, with his academic credentials, he could teach at the university. He applied for a job teaching math, but was turned down. So he had to farm. He had 160 acres, and does anyone know where his farm was? Who's not in the family? Yeah, you guys know. So his farm is where Assembly Hall, Memorial Stadium, and all the IU athletic facilities are right now. They had a house on 17th Street, and was it in the 1950s, where the descendants sold out to the university. And the university recently acknowledged that. So if you go on near the stadium, there's a little area there called Faris Way that they've marked. That's a kind of a road that comes off of the bypass south down to the stadium to try to, and there's a plaque that acknowledges the contributions of the family. Well, later in his life, he bought another chunk of land down here. And so the place up on 17th, that was the old place. The new place is right in Steer Park. And I know one of you mentioned that earlier. So if you go into the neighborhood right over there, at the back of the neighborhood, there's an old brick house, and that was his house. They date it to 1840. I'm not sure when the house was actually finished, but he did not get to enjoy it very long, sort of at the end of his life. But an amazing career and an amazing ministry he had here in the community.
And he is the brother-in-law to Thomas Smith.
Okay, he was Thomas Smith's brother-in-law.
Yeah.
All right. Nancy Smith Faris. Yeah. All right.
That house was part of the Underground Railroad.
And yeah, my understanding is that house was also part of the Underground Railroad. That's right. That they were also involved. Okay. Let me see. Right over. Okay, so right over here, I think if you just pivot, I can point to it. So here in this older part of the cemetery, this stone right here is for the Fee family. So Fee Lane, out by the stadiums. Robert Fee has the earliest birth date of anybody who's buried in here, again, as far as we know. So 1750, was born in Scotland. The story is he was courting his wife, and his what became his mother-in-law said, this man is not a Reformed Presbyterian. You cannot marry him. They apparently eloped, And he subsequently became a Reformed Presbyterian. And he brought his family to South Carolina. His wife died, remarried, then came to Bloomington, and so and then had a third wife here. And so he's buried here with some of his children. I think his third wife outlived him and is not buried here in the cemetery. So as far as we know, that's the oldest one. There are a number of people here who were born in Ireland or South Carolina who then were buried in this cemetery. Okay, a little quiz. So here, in memory of Martha, relict of the late Robert Fullerton. All right, so what does it mean to be a relict? Anyone know? It doesn't sound flattering, I realize that. What's that? So it's simply a widow who doesn't remarry. And so that's a 19th, 18th century term. So it isn't an insult at all. It's just a description that she never remarried after her husband died. And so they acknowledge that on the stone. All right, we'll keep moving, and then I will definitely say if you want to explore after the tour, you are welcome to look around. Let's go back this way. I'm going to point out a few more graves that might be of interest. All right. So here you see a lot of the Farises here.
She likes it.
Yes.
Is the Whitburn House on North College? Historic house?
Yes, although, so you're really going to get into the Presbyterian politics, but in the 1830s there was a division in our denomination, and literally about half of the people, half the elders, half the congregation. This happened nationwide, and so a group that left here ended up joining up with other Presbyterian groups, and it was mostly over that voting issue I talked about. And so those groups eventually coalesced into the United Presbyterian Church that's on 2nd Street. So that was a conglomeration of several different flavors of Presbyterian. And that's why I say, from a human standpoint, that stance on voting sort of kept this one group separate all that time. And even though we don't practice that principle the same way today, now there are other things that sort of make us unique. For example, has anyone ever been to a Reformed Presbyterian worship service? So yeah, well, some of you have, right? So what's unique about it, Sophia? Okay, so we sing a cappella. We sing the Psalms of the Bible set to music. So our worship style is very... Now, 150, 200 years ago, all the Presbyterians worshiped the same way. So that's why people like David Starr Jordan couldn't figure out, like, why can't you guys all get along? You all worship the same way. It was these other positions that were keeping them separate. Now it's kind of ironic that the position on voting isn't keeping us distinct, but we're worshiping kind of the same way we always did, and that's kept us unique. All right, well, John Dale Russell, who's here with his wife, is one of someone who in his day was very famous. He was a professor at IU in the School of Education, and then he went to the University of Chicago, and then served under the Eisenhower administration as one of, in what was the precursor to the U.S. Department of Education. And so had a long career, came back and retired in Bloomington, and served a long stint as one of the elders in the congregation. One thing you'll notice as we walk, and you may have seen it already, is that there are a number of unnamed children who are buried in the cemetery. And there's one right over here. Sorry, I'm trapping you. So right here, I mean, this one is more recent, 1950. Infant daughter of George and Hazel, I assume the Gregory family, from 1950. But there's about 30 graves that we're aware of around where child dying very young is buried and has no name on the grave. I want to point out this one because this is really unique. So Angeliva Anqui Qui, she was 1 day old, was buried in 2020. So I don't know how many Chinese people we have buried here, but she may be the only one. But it's a sign of kind of what's going on in our church. In our building, there is a Chinese-speaking congregation that meets in the Sunday afternoon. So we have a group that worships with us, and this was the daughter of the pastor of the Chinese church who died tragically right after she was born. And so she's here, kind of a sign that we're no longer the Scotch-Irish denomination that we were in our history, but now have people from all kinds of backgrounds that are a part of us. One more grave I want to point out is Lester Smith. So is this? No, this isn't it. Yeah, okay, great. Thank you. All right. So we're moving towards the newer part of the cemetery. So this is it here. Yeah, Henry Lester Smith. So he was the first dean of the School of Education at IU and served as the dean from 1916 to 1946, so 30 years, the dean of the School of Education. That name is worth noting because in the early 1900s, he came and interviewed a number of the older members of our congregation and wrote an article that was published about the Underground Railroad in Monroe County. And so he has firsthand accounts. And that story I told you briefly about Tony is one of the stories that he tells. And so if you can find that article, it's really fascinating because it talks about some specific instances where they were able to help slaves escape. Well, this ends the tour. I always think visiting a cemetery is somewhat sobering, and it does remind us of our own mortality. And these folks, part of the reason churches have graveyards is because they believe the promises of Jesus Christ, that when he returns again, the dead will rise, and those who are trusting in Christ will join him forever. Jesus, in fact, said, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he may die, yet he shall live." That's a wonderful promise. And so even as it's somewhat sobering, especially when we see the children buried here, there's also a great encouragement. You know this, right? That the graves face to the east, looking forward to the day of Jesus coming. So we're really glad you've joined us on this tour. We hope you've learned something about our community. If any of you would like to come visit us, you would be warmly welcome. We'd love to have you join us. Our church worships at 10:45 on Sunday mornings and then at 6 p.m. Sunday evenings. And you could actually see the way these people worshiped, pretty similar to the way they worship, although we have heat in the building. You read some of the stories about what they went through. They would ride their wagons out here, and they would worship. They would eat their lunch. They would worship, and it would be pretty grueling. And we're thankful for God's mercies to us. We have a vibrant congregation of about 225 people, and we love this community, and we love the fact that God has kept us here for all this time. And we're just trying to be faithful for our little bit of the time that we're here, and hope that those coming after us will keep serving Him. So any other questions you might have? Yeah.
There's a house about the same age as the Faris house and the Smith house in Green Acres. What do you know about that? Were they Covenanters as well?
So if I'm thinking right, is that the one that's off of what is it, Smith Road? No.
No, it's off 15, maybe 11. Yeah.
I don't know for sure.
Maybe 11, yeah.
And where the American history?
Okay, I don't think so. I don't think so.
It's the same age, and they're
Okay, yeah. I've learned that there's always more to learn, for sure. Yeah.
How about the Rain Tree House? Is that connected to the Covenanters?
I don't recognize that one either. I don't think so. No, I don't think so. Yes. So I don't want to make it sound like we were the only ones that were here working for the good of the community, but very much in at the ground floor at the beginning. All right. Well, thank you all for coming. Feel free to walk around. Yeah, appreciate it. Oh, good. Thanks for coming. I appreciate that.